Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast and Happy New Year. I'm Fraser Myers and back with me as ever we have Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And joining us this week in the studio we have Spike columnist Luke Gittos.
Hi.
Coming up on today's show, the rise and fall of Andrew Tate, the latest from the grooming-gang scandal and the emptiness of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. So Andrew Tate, possibly the world's most famous man on the internet at least, maybe people in the real world don't know who he is, has been arrested in Romania just before the new year under suspicions of people trafficking. I mean, we're going to put that arrest to one side for a moment. Let's just talk about the Tate phenomenon a little bit. I mean, he came to attention most recently with this kind of spat with Greta Thunberg on Twitter. Tom, do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so he basically sort of sent for Greta Thunberg by talking about how many supercars he drives and, you know, all the carbon emissions that they spew out and so on. So I forget what the specific message was, but, you know, suggesting that he should get in contact with her or whatever. So her or whoever runs her social media, more likely, fired back with this very retweeted and liked tweet saying, yes, here's my email. Please do enlighten me. smalldickenergy@getalife.com. Widely seen to have won that particular round, not least because in his follow-up video, Andrew Tate, in his kind of Romanian warehouse/mansion, smoking a cigar, did this very lame response video, you know.
I've not been owned, I swear, yeah.
Exactly. Which some people on the internet speculated was actually the spark for his arrest, although I don't think that's necessarily been corroborated by the authorities in Romania. So, you know, aside from anything else, you do think how tragic it is that is how 2022 probably had to end, which is with a kind of very high-profile Twitter spat between Greta Thunberg and Andrew Tate, the two totems of our era.
Yeah.
The best we can produce, apparently.
And Luke, I mean, have you followed Andrew Tate at all? Are you familiar with some of his work? I mean, what would you say is behind the phenomenon? What makes him the most searched person on the internet?
Well, I have to admit, I first became aware of Andrew Tate thanks to being spoken about on this podcast, which I do resent you for. But ever since then, I have looked into him because I do think he's interesting. I think fundamentally he fills a particular void in the lives of some young men, which is a kind of vision for what being a man is. Now, that vision is very corrupted, an awful vision. He believes that women are property. He believes that men should be able to cheat on their wives. He seems to have very little regard for men playing any serious role in the family. But nonetheless, he presents a kind of what is presented as a coherent vision of what it is to be a modern man. And he's not the only one. I think he represents a kind of more extreme version of what we see in people like Jordan Peterson and others who kind of are filling a void in the sense of what makes a modern man.
Yeah.
And, you know, you have to, while I think we can laugh at Andrew Tate, and I think we should regularly laugh at Andrew Tate, I think we do have to take his reach quite seriously because it's undeniable that he appeals to a lot of people and a lot of young men.
Yeah.
So we have to ask very serious questions about where that void comes from. And I do think at a time where society tends to do men down, I think that is undeniable about some aspects of modern life. You know, it can be difficult for young men in particular to see worthwhile leaders and icons out there, people who aren't Andrew Tate, who aren't Jordan Peterson, who do present a kind of cohesive and attractive vision for what it is to be a man today. We're more likely to see men being presented as something problematic, I think, in general, in modern life. So I think that's why he's so popular.
Yeah.
He presents an idea of what it is to be a man, and that, for a lot of young people, is appealing.
Tom, on one level, isn't it also just that some of his content is quite funny and attention-grabbing?
I think that's definitely a piece of it because you don't go viral necessarily just because of the fact that people are sat there, you know, plaintively thinking about what it is that you're saying. Sometimes outrage works on the internet more so than almost anywhere else. So similar, in some respects, it's also a similar figure to like an Alex Jones or whatever, as far as there's going to be a sizable chunk of that audience who are just kind of enjoying the outrage, enjoying the ridiculousness, enjoying the kind of over-the-top humour, as you say, of some of the kind of statements that he's made, you know, holding forth on everything, not just from women, but whether or not you should drink sparkling water or not, whether or not that makes you a bitch if you don't want to drink it. Like, this is just sort of
ultimately...
Afraid
of the bubbles if you don't
Afraid of the
drink
bubbles. I mean, direct quote. That's part of the picture here. And I think that kind of hints to part of what fueled his kind of rise to prominence, you know, back in the summer of last year when he was kind of deplatformed across various different social media platforms, when he was the most searched person on the internet, bigger than Donald Trump and Kim Kardashian combined. I think has partly to do with that kind of virality. He kind of encourages his fans to kind of share his videos on TikTok and so on and so forth. So they're all just kind of constantly swirling around. But he's also kind of definitely a kind of byproduct of the culture that we live in.
Yeah.
As far as if you do have a very stern culture of you can't say that, you will create a bunch of characters who are going to say that over and over and over again. And that they're saying is probably going to be quite horrendous. Now, it's not to suggest that outrage at views like his is illegitimate pearl clutching. It's just to say that in a kind of time when we pearl clutch about absolutely everything, you give a lot of room for people like that to operate. And I also think you raise some people's kind of tolerance for genuinely outrageous things to quite a high degree. So in so many respects, I think he is a kind of creature of our culture, a kind of like dark reflection of a lot of what's going on. And you see that in just his willingness to just say the most outrageous thing possible. And similarly, as Luke was saying, in an age when kind of masculinity is referred to as toxic, when men are sort of done down and whatever, you also create a space for these grifters to pass off misogyny as masculinity and to try and, fill that void in any way possible, because there's not really any space in the mainstream for that kind of discussion, I guess.
And Tom, you hinted earlier at the censorship of Andrew Tate, which, I mean, to some extent he's come back on some mediums thanks to Elon Musk letting him back on Twitter. But, people have called for him to be censored again, like, various Labour Party spokespeople have said this is what happens when you don't have regulation of the internet. I mean, Luke, what do you make of that attempt to simply respond to someone like Andrew Tate with censorship, with clamping down on it?
Well, it's consistently disastrous, isn't it? Particularly in the case of Andrew Tate, who sees his own arrest as some action of the Matrix. He appeals to the Matrix taking him down. He sees and is able to present the government as someone who is trying to crush him through their instruments of censorship. So this entirely plays into his hands, and you will fail to censor someone like Andrew Tate, because even if you shut down his personal accounts, his content will be shared. That was a big way of big method of his functioning, is to make his supporters share the most outrageous things that he says as widely as possible. And there's only so much that internet censorship can do to prevent that. So one, I think it's a hiding to nothing. And two, I think it helps his overall cause by presenting him as some kind of pariah.
So I've been thinking about this for a while now. I mean, does it really make sense that the same company that controls half of online retail is also allowed to passively eavesdrop on our private conversations at home? And what about that big search engine company that controls 90% of internet searches and runs our email services? Should it really get to track everything we do on our smartphones? Big tech, something we talk a lot about on this show, is more powerful than most countries are. And the way it gets its power, the way it makes its profit, is by exploiting our personal data. But you can do what I do and put a layer of protection between your online activity and these tech juggernauts. The way I do that is with ExpressVPN. I mean, if you think about how much of our lives is on the internet, sadly, basically every site we visit, every video we're watching, every message we're sending is being tracked and data mined, then it's obvious you've got to do something about this. The great thing about ExpressVPN is that when you run it on your device, the software hides your IP address. Now, that's important because it's something big tech can use to personally identify you. So with ExpressVPN, it's making your activity a lot harder to trace and sell to advertisers. It also encrypts 100% of your internet data. It's keeping you safe from all those hackers and eavesdroppers on your network. And that's why ExpressVPN is rated the #1 VPN service by CNET, Wired, TechRadar, and all the other countless people in the know. What I like most about it is just how easy it is to use. You download the app on your phone, on your computer, and you tap one button and you're protected. So stop handing over your personal data to the big tech monopoly. Don't let it mine your activity and sell your information. Protect yourself with the VPN I trust to keep me safe online. Visit expressvpn.com/spiked. That's expressvpn.com/spiked, and you'll get an extra 3 months for free. Go to expressvpn.com/spiked right now to learn more. Let's move on to talk about the long-running grooming gang scandal. One of the centres of that scandal was Rotherham, famously. And it was well known that many councillors and local authorities and the police knew that the grooming gangs problem was going on, but they in some way either suppressed it or preferred not to talk about it. Now, there was someone who was named in one of the independent reports, a man called Rakib Ehsan, and he's alleged to have actually suppressed discussion of this within the local authority. And a GB News investigation has found that he is now working in the NHS as in a senior diversity and inclusion role. I mean, look, what have you made of that? I mean, it's absurd and insulting at the same time, it feels.
Yeah, it's frightening, but you can believe that it would happen, that someone who was involved in this scandal in this way would be over-promoted almost immediately back within the public sector. I mean, Hussein was someone who was directly accused of stifling the very conversations that needed to happen in Rotherham in order to deal with this problem. He was also someone who was accused of making spurious allegations of racism in order to shut down the same conversation. He resigned and was then, it appears to have almost immediately found employment elsewhere in the public sector in, as you say, a diversity and inclusion role. He's also someone who's made very questionable remarks about Jews, claiming that they have control and influence because of their resources, in his words. So it is almost beyond belief that this has not yet been widely picked up on. I think it's true to say that the only member of parliament who's picked up on this is Zach Goldsmith. That was what Charlie Peters, who's responsible for the investigation, tweeted earlier today. So it's remarkable this hasn't got greater traction. But also it's worth remembering that in Rotherham, Hussein is one example of a broader problem, which is that individual accountability here has gone completely by the wayside. As well as Alexis Jay's report, there was an IOPC report into the police's handling of Rotherham over those years. And that report was widely criticised because although it made a number of claims about failings at every single level of the police, no one was identified as individually responsible, no heads rolled within the police. And this comes at a time when, at the end of last year, we had an enormous discussion around police accountability. You'll remember all the reports and publications around why it is that disciplinary investigations into the police don't go anywhere. Rotherham wasn't mentioned in that discussion at all. So what I think is becoming increasingly clear with this kind of disregard of individual accountability in the case of Rotherham is repeat something that we've written on Spiked and said on the podcast elsewhere, which is that the victims of these crimes are just dealt with differently.
Yeah.
It's not thought that these young women, northern working class women, deserve the kind of accountability that other victims deserve. And I think that's the lesson that we take away from Hussein and others.
And Tom, isn't it also the case that there's a nervousness around the perpetrators, particularly, talking about their ethnicity? That's something that comes up in just about every single report you see into grooming gangs.
And this is in the figure like Hussein, you see someone who was directly involved in allegedly trying to suppress that particular discussion in the name of community relations, in the name of community cohesion, which seems to me a bizarre conclusion to draw anyway. If anything, you're going to kind of inflame the extremes by not dealing with these sorts of issues in a very clear-eyed sort of fashion. And also just, I think, shows the moral rot at the heart of the kind of, whether we want to call it politically correct, identity politics, wokeness, whatever you might want to say, which has just kind of taken root in so many of our public sector institutions. The idea that it doesn't do to talk about certain things. The idea that in the name of a cohesive multicultural society, you should throw some of the most genuinely vulnerable people in society, young, working class, often in care girls, under the bus, is morally abhorrent. And yet this is done in the name of all that is good and holy, and all that a progressive liberal person should actually seek to do. Maybe that's part of the reason people still struggle with it. But then again, I think the fact that this doesn't even register, given the scale of what we're talking about here, in Rotherham, the numbers vary slightly, but 1,500 roughly victims who are found, similar numbers in Telford. This is something that has happened. The length and breadth of England and parts of the rest of the UK as well. And yet we still find ourselves talking endlessly about, again, kind of minor aspects of sexual misconduct in Parliament, for instance. So a journalist gets a knee touch 20 years ago, and that's front page news for a week. And yet this, it's not that it's not investigated. There was a time when it wasn't investigated. It took people like Andrew Norfolk at the Times and others to really start to take this particularly seriously. But even at a time when we've got to the point where we know about a lot of these things, we just kind of discuss it and then promptly move on. And that seems to be what's happened in Rotherham as well. Again, no heads rolled. People just moved on, got another job somewhere else, pretty fair wage, and no one bothered to even kind of check what his particular background was.
And it seems quite significant that this was a diversity and inclusion job. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the proliferation of these non-jobs across the state. I mean, what do you make of that aspect of this, Luke?
Well, I think that it clearly, in this case, hides a host of evils, doesn't it? And it's ironic that another aspect of GB News' reporting was that Hussein was appointed to basically lecture the police on diversity, having nonetheless stifled the one of the most significant investigations and complex investigations they'd ever had. And so I guess to diversity seems to be more about kind of baiting and being sectarian. And that, I suppose, what we see in all areas where this is promoted is a kind of push towards defending one's own particular ethnic group or background at the expense of cohesion. Because as Tom suggests, this does not appear to be a figure who is competent in promoting cohesion, but nonetheless has been appointed in quite a senior role designed to do precisely that.
And it was interesting as well because on that point about the reasons that were given behind this sort of suppression, not just in Rotherham, but in the media, the kind of general blackout of public discussion, because it was for a very long time that this was essentially presented, the grooming-gangs phenomenon was essentially presented as a far-right conspiracy theory. The only people you would find willing to talk about it were like the BNP and the EDL and so on. In fact, Anne Cryer, the former Labour MP for Keighley, which was one of the kind of earlier people sounding the alarm about this, and of course got all the death threats and shouts of bigotry as a result of this, made exactly this point that when people first came to her to explain what was going on, there was she still even had this level of resistance because the only people I've heard this from is those people, you know. And it just strikes me as if you wanted to kind of create a sort of strategy, unthinking or thinking, that would be basically create a situation where a horrible industrial scale crime was only going to be talked about by the most nefarious people in public debate. This is what you would do. And it's monstrous in so many different ways. And it's incredible that if it wasn't for people like Charlie Peters at GB News, former Spiked intern, I should mention, following up on this stuff, we wouldn't even know about these matters. It's something which is still a kind of lingering scandal, even in the places where we thought all of these investigations had taken place.
So finally, let's talk about the two big political speeches. Both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer have delivered their New Year's messages. I can't say that I saw much of a big difference between the two of them.
They're even held in the same venue. Did you see this?
Yeah. 24 hours apart in East London.
Says it all really. But
I mean, this seems to, more than anything, Luke, seems to signify a new, quite drab era of politics being upon us. Is this the return of technocracy, managerialism, that kind of politics?
Yeah, I mean, I saw comparisons to 1997 where Sunak was clearly referencing Tony Blair in his revelation of the key promises by which...
The 5 pledges.
The 5 pledges, which Tony Blair did back in the lead up to the 97 general election, in order to kind of give the public a method of measuring competence. And of course, in 97, you did see this kind of contest over the centre ground. New Labour was an attempt to steal some of that centre ground back from the Tories, particularly around law and order and around public finances. And there's a lot of parallels here today. The difference with today is that we are facing crisis in many areas of public life. Our economically, in terms of our public services, we are in a deep, deep hole. And technocracy does not appear to ever be the answer. As we've written on Spike this week, technocracy consistently fails to deal with real problems of economic crisis. So I think what we are entering in this general election that will come at some point in 2024 is kind of a tussle over who can appear the most competent for longest. And I think that is a very, very depressing prospect for voters because it doesn't cut through. No one, I mean, people are not inspired by this technocratic model of politics, although the polling seems to suggest that Keir Starmer is now enjoying a comfortable lead and has done for some months. That does seem to be as a result of the collapse of Tory support, Tory infighting, and a hemorrhaging of their support around the constituencies they won in the last election. So I think there must be more to the next general election. There is something to say that, there is something to say that Keir Starmer being reserved, we'll come on to talk about Starmer's speech, which was completely lacking in any detail. There's something to say that they would keep stuff back from speech at this stage just in case the government stole policies from them, which is all very possible given that they don't seem to have many original ideas of their own. But at the moment we are left with a tussle over the middle ground, technocracy, and very little big thinking about how to tackle the major problems that we face.
It was interesting, Tom. I think, Sunak obviously selling himself on this competence, but still not really offering much detail, not really showing that he has a grip on the challenges that he wants to face.
I mean, the speech seemed to consist largely of talking about money that had already been announced, or these kind of tinkering little schemes that had already been implemented.
Family hubs.
Family hubs being another one. They love their hubs, don't they? See, there seems to be this kind of idea, in the absence of any big thinking, what we'll do is either create a kind of like parallel version of a service that exists. Like you could have your you could have your medical treatment at home via Zoom or something. Yeah. So even it's like a pale imitation, or it's something that people probably don't really need. Some bloke in a library handing out leaflets about changing nappies or something. This is the most that they can manage. But so on the one hand, you have this kind of attempt to say, I've got a grip on this particular crisis, and kind of failing to do that. It was also presented, Sunak's speech, as his big vision speech, which is what you hear people in politics talk about, usually when the person involved has no vision whatsoever. If you have to say it, you probably don't have it. And what did he come out with? I mean, it was family, enterprise, maths was another one. The things, I mean, I don't know anyone who's against enterprise, family or maths, but, maybe they're out there.
Some sickos.
Some sort of big dividing line for him and the rest of politics. But it's almost like he couldn't have an ideology if he tried. You're trying to will one into existence and failing miserably. And it is just particularly depressing because you do see that completely mirrored on the other side. There's very little that distinguishes the two parties. Now, we are really back to them kind of dancing on the head of a pin, running on competence, as you say, or Tory cronyism on the Labour side. Yeah. And given the fact that, again, that technocratic politics, as Luke was saying, is proven time and again incapable of dealing with moments of crisis, often makes things worse. They have a tendency to kind of hold towards groupthink, to double down on failed orthodoxies, whether it's, in relation to energy or anything like that. You're not really seeing a break from any of the very damaging green policies, for instance, that have really helped dig this particular hole for us. And yet at the same time, there's no kind of broader vision as to how we might carve out a different society in which these kinds of crises and injustices don't take place. There's not even any real prospect of that whatsoever. So it does feel like we're back to that world of competing bank managers, or in this case, kind of competing Blair tribute acts. Yeah, really, and
competing bean counters,
and in even more deracinated and unconvincing form. I think with both of them.
I think one of the telling things about the Keir Starmer speech was his appropriation of the slogan "taking back control," which to him seemed to mean sort of devolution. For me, that really sort of summed up. He inadvertently highlighted the chasm, between the sort of deep challenges we face, the kind of populist moment that we all had great hopes for, and the drabness of what he's actually offering.
Yeah, I think Starmer is currently relying on the collapse of support among the Red Wall constituencies in order to win them back, rather than offering them any positive vision about what a Labour government would do with these particular areas and what it would mean for them to take. I mean, as you say, taking back control and devolution actually mean completely different things. Taking back control was about national sovereignty. Yeah. It was about creating a nation, a collective country to work together. Devolution is about the opposite. It's about effectively breaking the country down. The other thing to say is that, the Labour Party at the moment, I saw some reporting in the Times that there is worries among Keir Starmer's front bench that they're not cutting through in the media enough, and that not enough people, for example, know who the shadow transport secretary is. Of course, I guess the problem, I think, amongst these communities is not that they don't know who the shadow front bench are, so they don't care. Yeah. Labour has become so detached from these communities. Keir Starmer's Labour Party is not the Labour Party of old. It's not rooted in the communities that it purports to represent. It doesn't have support amongst the working communities that did vote for Brexit, that did believe in taking back control. So they are forced, therefore, to reach for the lines of that populist moment that gave rise to the Brexit vote without really believing any of it in substance.
Tom, final word?
I just think on the devolution thing, because I think it is quite revealing of how out of ideas Labour are. I mean, they're kind of just deferring to what Gordon Brown said in his big report recently. It's a lot of kind of old Blairites and Brownites are kind of being given the task of writing up various different reports. There was a David Blunkett one on skills as well, and so on and so forth. So they're kind of having to, so lacking in talent, they kind of go back to the old guard, but also the ideas such as they are not really there. I'm going to steal a point that you made earlier in the office, Fraser, but it does betray a lack of ideas of almost saying, you can make the decisions. What decisions? You work it out. There is a kind of, in the absence of any real vision for the country, it's quite, it's something that they can present as a radical change, as they would present it, but at the same time involves them dodging accountability for actually steering the country in a different direction. And then when you see the substance of what they're talking about, again, we're back to the hubs. I mean, before Sunak's speech, about a day before, Labour were talking out the fact that they want to radically overhaul job centres so that local authorities run them. That passes for a big political announcement these days.
To the barricades.
Exactly, to the barricades for local authority-controlled job centres. You wouldn't put that on the side of a bus or on a leaflet, but there we go. That's the age we live in, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.